Yours. We're so pleased that you're here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I appreciate your interest in the book and hearing a little bit about the subject. So I'm a professor of history at the University of Michigan, and I'm in the departments of African American Studies and History, and a really cool institution at University of Michigan called the Residential College. And my specialty is 19th century American history, especially race, slavery, the Civil War, the American South. And I really became interested in this particular topic that we're going to talk about tonight, which is the really precarious, fragile freedom for Black people in New York City before the Civil War. I came to that topic actually through researching a different topic. And then I kept seeing references to this group called the New York Kidnapping Club, and just a few references, very skeletal, very, sort of quick iterations of this group. And I wanted to know more about who they were, what they were fighting, and who was really battling against them here in New York City, really in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and into the Civil War. So I think if you bear with me for a minute, I'd like to give just a real quick historical reminder that will, I hope, provide some context for why New York City is such a hotbed for, sort of pro-slavery, pro-South sentiment before the Civil War. And I think it's necessary because, we often think of New York City today as this pluralistic democracy, this progressive, politically progressive place. We think of perhaps abolitionists and anti-slavery activists. It is, after all, in some ways, not only the capital of the country, but the capital of what we consider, the free North before the Civil War. So my point is that is based on a much darker, much bleaker history that So the historical background is important because this is the culture, this is the background for why the New York Kidnapping Club comes into existence. And it really starts with a piece of the Constitution, the nation's founding document. And in the Constitution, as it came out of the convention in Philadelphia in 1787, says, if you somehow are able to make it to freedom, if you are an enslaved person in South Carolina or Florida or Texas, and somehow against tremendous odds and at tremendous personal risk, you make it to freedom in the North, into some place like Boston or New York or Philadelphia, that doesn't mean you're free. In fact, the Constitution's Fugitive Slave Clause, which is what it's officially known as, required Northern communities to return anybody who might be labeled a runaway. So this is a recipe for disaster for Black Americans who live across the free states from California to Maine. And the reason is because it's very, very hard to tell whether somebody is self-emancipated, meaning they freed themselves, right? They're runaways from slavery and somehow made it to a life in New York, or whether in fact they had always been free, right? They were born to a free mother and had been born into freedom. So this confusing, ambiguous milieu is what makes life so precarious for Black people all across the Northeast and the Upper Midwest, including the subject of my book, which is New York. So the point is that in order to keep the Union together, in order to make the United States possible, free states and slave states had to compromise with this fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. And that meant that going forward, this compromise with slavery would govern relationships between the states all the way until it collapsed during the Civil War in 1860 and 1861 with secession. So why New York? And in fact, even though there are similar kinds of cases that are going on in Boston, there's a very famous incident in which a guy named George Latimer is arrested as a runaway in Boston in the early 1840s. Lots of stories in Philadelphia, plenty of stories in Detroit and other places. But in the book that I've written, I say quite bluntly that New York City is the most pro-slavery, pro-South city north of the Mason-Dixon line. And it's not something that I say lightly. And the reason why that is because New York City is heavily dependent on Southern grown cotton. And that's why Wall Street is in the subtitle of the book, because in many ways, we've forgotten how much of Gotham's wealth and power is built on the backs of enslaved people. So all that cotton that's grown in the southern states, it needs to be harvested. It needs to be baled up. And then somebody has to get that raw material of cotton to the factories and the mills that will turn the raw cotton into fine linens and beautiful textiles and clothing. And those tend to be in New England. They also tend to be in the UK, particularly in Manchester and Liverpool, those factories. But who's facilitating the movement of those hundreds of thousands of bales of cotton from the markets in places like New Orleans to Liverpool in the UK? Well, that's where New York financiers come in. They are kind of the go-between. They're the middle guys between all of that cotton that's grown and harvested on the backs of enslaved Black people and the tremendous money that's going to be made off of it once those raw materials are turned into finished goods. So New York City plays a pivotal role in connecting slave-grown cotton with the places where it can be turned into finished products. And that's in significant way how New York City becomes so wealthy and so powerful and so populous in such a short amount of time. Not only does it make New York rich and powerful, but the fact that New Yorkers, particularly those bankers and insurance agents and merchants who live in the shadow of Wall Street, what makes them so strongly attached to the South is this belief that the cotton trade has to continue at all costs. So nothing can disturb that process. And if somebody is accused of being a runaway in the streets of Manhattan and we have to send them back to slavery, we don't really care all that much whether they're born free or born enslaved, as long as we sort of make those sacrificial victims every so often to make the South happy, to keep the Union together, and perhaps just as importantly, keep the prosperity under which that Union is maintained. So this renders New York City a very harsh, difficult place to live for Black people before the Civil War. But nonetheless, and this is an important part of the story too, there are really important, vigorous, vibrant Black neighborhoods in New York City. There's about 15 to 20,000 African Americans who live in New York City before the Civil War. And they do form really important neighborhoods in pockets all around the city, including the important Seneca Village, which was an important Black neighborhood that was pretty much destroyed in order to make room for Central Park. So those thousands of men, women, and children, some of them were born free as a result of New York's ending of slavery. Some of them were undoubtedly escaped enslaved people who had made it to freedom somehow. But all of them, regardless of whether they were born free or born enslaved, all of them are potential victims of this sacrificial system that returns accused runaways in order to keep the bonds between the North and the South intact. And so this is the background, the context for the New York Kidnapping Club. And it's not really a social organization. They all knew each other, these people that in this so-called club. But really, they get their name from a black activist named David Ruggles. And he calls them, he labels these guys the New York Kidnapping Club because they're the ones who are making existence so fragile for Black men, women, and children here in the 1830s and 1840s. There were police officers involved. One is a guy named Tobias Boudinot, and he's really a real piece of work. He is somebody who is sort of the ringleader of the kidnapping club. He works with his pal, Daniel Nash. There's also judges like Samuel Betts and the city recorder, kind of like a city judge named Richard Riker. And then there are slave catchers, professional slave catchers who make money off of accusing people of being runaways and returning them for reward to Southern masters. And there are some lawyers who are involved. There's this one character, a guy named Fontaine H. Pettus. There's a good 19th century name for you. And Fontaine Pettus was a lawyer who originally was from Virginia, but he actually sets up his law practice in New York City and places ads in newspapers saying, if Southerners will send descriptions of their runaways, he will be on the lookout for them. And by the way, put 20 bucks, in the mail as a retainer, and I'll keep an eye out for them and let you know if I see them. So these police officers and judges and slave catchers and lawyers, they are the ones who made up this sort of loosely organized group called the New York Kidnapping Club. And what they did was they prowled the streets of Lower Manhattan and even into Brooklyn. Boudinot, the police officer, and his buddy Daniel Nash, they would walk up and down the streets of Lower Manhattan, the dirty alleyways and the crowded pathways, on the lookout for anybody that they could even remotely accuse of being a runaway. And they, like I said, really didn't care whether it was born or enslaved, as long as they could, collect the reward and return them to obtain money. We don't know exactly how many African-American men, women, and children fell into the clutches of the New York Kidnapping Club, in part because they really operate with little oversight. I mean, there's no impunity. What often happened, Tobias Boudinot would arrest somebody, sometimes in the middle of the night, accuse them of being a runaway, take that person before the city recorder, Richard Riker, who was the one charged with ultimately deciding whether this person was actually John Smith, who had escaped slavery from Virginia 10 years ago, or whether this was, in fact, the person he claimed to be, a free person, having been born in New York, 30 years prior. And within hours, somebody could be taken off the streets, swept into the courts before Richard Riker, and taken into Southern bondage, really before their families even knew they were missing. And if we want, we can talk a little bit more about individual circumstances and cases in the Q&A. But there's one particularly difficult story in the book involving a young boy named Henry Scott, who's 7 years old and is arrested as a runaway, sitting in the classroom of his school, and is arrested and taken before Richard Riker along with his father. So these are harrowing, difficult, troubling parts of our past that I think we sometimes gloss over when we sort of paint the slave South and the abolitionist North in these stark categories. And we find, in fact, that the truth is much more nuanced and much more complicated than that. So throughout the 1830s and much of the 1840s, Boudinot and Nash and Riker and some of these other characters, they are terrorizing the city's Black population. But they don't do so unchallenged. And that's a really key point here, because if we just left the story at that, it would be incredibly depressing. It's a depressing story as it is, but it would be even more bleak if we stopped there and failed to recognize that there were people who really fought against the activities of the Kidnapping Club every day of their lives. And for lack of a better word, the hero of the Kidnapping Club book that I wrote is a guy named David Ruggles, who is definitely somebody who deserves to be much better known among the general American public than he is. He is, in effect, right up there with Frederick Douglass. He doesn't last as long as Frederick Douglass because David Ruggles dies much younger. But in terms of his willingness to put his life on the line and work so tirelessly for racial justice, David Ruggles is somebody really worth learning more about. I'll just give you a really quick synopsis, but we can talk more about him in the Q&A if you'd like. But, I first learned about this guy, David Ruggles, through a biography that was written by another historian named Graham Hodges. And the biography is really amazing. It really reveals so many interesting details about David Ruggles' life. And the important point in general to make is that, Ruggles had his ear to the ground constantly, day after day, in learning or trying to learn about the activities Boudinot was engaged in, what Riker was doing, any circumstances of racial injustice, either in New York City and Manhattan or in Brooklyn. He was right there in the thick of it. And so much so that he really felt physically the toll that this all took on him. And I think that's in large part why he died at a young age. But he's an imperfect hero in a sense, because even though he is tireless in his pursuit of the New York Kidnapping Club and their nefarious activities, he's also, not somebody that wants to make nice. I mean, he's an agitator, right? He's a radical. He wants to cause trouble because he thinks that people are in danger. He understands the precarious nature of freedom for Black people in New York City. And he is frustrated and angry that the legal authorities, the political authorities, the police force is not only uncaring, but also in many ways complicit. And Ruggles was a journalist in part, and he publishes this newspaper. It's called The Mirror of Liberty, which you can check it out online if you're interested. And in the pages of this newspaper, he records in minute detail the individual cases of the activities of the Kidnapping Club and the Black people they arrest. And again, he's the one who calls them out by name publicly in the newspaper. He calls Boudinot out. He calls Riker out. He says Nash is, the devil. He's not afraid, to make waves. So he's not the only one. There are, of course, many, many other Black activists. They form an organization called the New York Vigilance Committee, which also included some white anti-slavery activists. And they do battle in the courts and on the streets of New York City in this period. And in essence, that's what the meat of the book is about. So the story that I've written really ends during the Civil War, because at that point, sort of New Yorkers have to make a decision as to whether, in fact, they are going to continue to cheapen Black lives, to make freedom fragile for their Black residents, or whether they're going to join the Union effort, ultimately, thanks to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, that will slowly bring the nation to understand the need to end slavery altogether. But even though there is some change in opinion in New York City, the city still remains very sort of democratic, big D democratic, I mean Democratic Party. And many of you will know that the parties have, of course, sort of switched their identities 180 degrees. In this period of American history, the Democrats were the reactionary party. If Donald Trump had been alive in 1850, he would have been a Democrat in New York City, because they're the ones who are so conservative on the issues of race and so intent on maintaining that trade with cotton in the South. In fact, New York City votes against Lincoln in 1860. They also vote against a referendum that would have given Black men the right to vote. That goes down in flames. And even as New York joins the Union, obviously, and enjoins the fight against the rebellion in the South, there are still remaining conservative forces in the city, particularly around issues of race. My next book is going to be about the draft riots in 1863 in part. And as part of the research for that, I've been reading this newspaper that comes out every week out of Manhattan, all throughout the Civil War and all throughout the period after the war. And it has the very unfortunate title of The New York Weekly Caucasian. So, you know, I feel like I have to take a shower after reading that on a daily basis because it's so reprehensible. But it shows you, you know, that even during the war, when the state has cast its lot with freedom in the Union, in fact, those forces are very much still evident and powerful and vocal, and that'll continue into the period after the Civil War. I'm going to conclude the sort of, you know, book talk, lecture part of this, and then we can move on to Q&A, with just some acknowledgement that what we've seen in 2020, particularly in the summer of 2020 in the wake of the protests over George Floyd's murder, are some unsettling parallels, perhaps you know, maybe even continuing threads for what I found in New York City before the Civil War, which is that unfortunately, legal and political authorities can be grossly indifferent to Black lives, and not only that, but can be complicit in the endangering of those lives. And this has been true for a long time in American history. Now, that might make you think that these issues perhaps are so intractable that, you know, we'll just throw up our hands. Instead, and inspiration in people like David Ruggles, who's just this amazing and, as I said, tireless advocate for racial equality. So I'll conclude by also mentioning one important caveat here, which is, you know, highlighting the racism and the fragile freedom for Black people in New York City or in other cities like Boston and Philadelphia does nothing to ameliorate or erase the horrors of Southern slavery that existed for, you know, 2.5 centuries and more. This is not about, you know, saying, oh, look how bad New York was, and by comparison somehow, you know, I don't know how one could do that, but somehow making the argument that by comparison, well, everybody was bad and they're all the same. And of course, you know, that's far, far from the truth, and nobody could take away the evils of slavery as it existed in the American South. But it is to say that the story that we as Americans hold on to sometimes in our political slogans, notions that, you know, America can be great again, that there's some past that can be recovered and restored in a positive way, really fails when we know our history. And we realize that the story of America is as much about the denial of freedom as it is about freedom itself. So that's my story. And, you know, lots of this in terms of details we could hash out in Q&A. I also invite people who are perhaps watching this at a later date, not live. If they want, they can always shoot me an email question. And I'm pretty easily findable on the internet, but my email address is johnwells, JONWELLS @umich.edu. Thank you.
Carol, do you want to ask any questions?
I don't, but I really appreciate you writing this book. Some of this I know from previous um, education, but there's a lot of details I don't, and I actually am interested in reading your book now because I think the richness will be in the details and the stories that you tell, and the timing of it couldn't be better. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for those.
I mean, I think any time is good, but you know, people are talking a little bit more right now.
Yeah, as well they should. And I think, there's a couple other books that those listening in might be interested in. One is about the transatlantic slave trade, and the fact that New York City is an important port in the transatlantic slave trade for 50 years after it's rendered illegal by Congress. And that's also part of the story, which I didn't really get a chance to talk about. But if you're really interested in that, you could look up a book by my friend John Harris, which is called The Last Slave Ships. And there's some great work on pre-civil New York, like Eric Foner's Gateway to Freedom. Leslie Alexander and Leslie Harris have both books in New York City before the Civil War. So, there's plenty of good stuff out there. I think many historians are trying to reach out beyond the sort of academic audience that we tend always to write for, and try to reach a broader audience about some of the points we feel like we need to make. So
Professor Wells, can you hear me?
I can indeed.
So I have a couple questions too. What kind of support, I think you sort of, you talked about it briefly, what kind of support did Ruggles have? And how did he generate his strong desire to risk his life, I would assume?
That's a really interesting question. And I think that's an important question for all of us to think about because, there's a meme that goes around on Twitter and Instagram sometimes and Facebook, which I think we've all seen, which is, if you ever wonder what you would have done during slavery or during the Holocaust, you're doing it right now. Which is, in other words, what would we have done in the similar circumstances in the 1830s and 40s? But you know what? Out of the 350,000 people living in New York City at the time, there's only one David Ruggles.
Yeah.
And he's a guy, like I said, it's tough to know where someone gets that tremendous energy and commitment. In Graham Hodges' biography of Ruggles, he points out that Ruggles had been born into freedom in Connecticut, and then sort of made his way into New York City in the 1820s. And his father was a blacksmith, which in this period of American history, particularly for Black communities, it's a very respected, highly regarded artisan craft, blacksmithing. So perhaps he learned of equality or acquired his sense of justice under those circumstances. But he's just one of these 1 in a million kind of people who really, reshapes our history. And I couldn't really have written this book without him because he's the one, as I try to say in his magazine, his newspaper called Mirror of Liberty, he's the one who writes down all of these details and allow me to sort of corroborate them with other newspapers. He's the one who detailed conversations with Boudinot and Riker and Nash. He goes to Brooklyn, the heart of Brooklyn, in the late 1830s, long after slavery is supposed to be rendered illegal. And he finds that right in the heart of Brooklyn, there's a family holding enslaved people as slaves. And yeah, there's no bridges at this time, so he has to cross the East River on the ferry, and he goes to the house and knocks on the door. This is the kind of thing he does, and he's fearless. And like I said, he deserves to be much better known. There is a plaque that mentions him on L'Esplanade Street, where he had his store and his bookstore for a while in Lower Manhattan. But you really have to sort of keep your eye out for it. So, I hope, if nothing else, people will read my book, but also Graham Hodges's book about David Ruggles, and learn more about this guy who's really is an American hero in my estimation.
So I was writing down questions when you were speaking. One thinks of New York as always as a mercantile city. So, like you started off talking about the fact that, of course, slavery is going to become a big issue for New York because that's where they're making their money. They're going to need to continue where's the money coming from? Was the same sort of thing happening in other major East Coast cities, or was New York kind of unique for this?
I think, as I said, New York is an outlier in some ways, in the extreme level to which, they're willing to go to appease white Southern slave owners by so-called runaways. I think they are kind of an extreme version of something that I agree was happening all across the free states in the years before the Civil War. I mentioned one that is a little closer to home for the libraries here, which is the Latimer case in Boston. And what's interesting is that, a lot of white Northerners in places like Lynn, Massachusetts, or, Hartford, Connecticut, or Detroit would have said, I don't care about Southern slavery. I don't live in North Carolina or Texas. It's not really anything I have to deal with. So it's not really my problem. It's a problem for Southerners to deal with. But when the Fugitive Slave Act is intensified with a law in 1850, that really makes Northern communities more actively complicit in returning runaways, according to what's required of them by the law. So I mentioned that there's this fugitive slave clause in the Constitution, but the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 really puts teeth into it. And not only does it, of course, frighten and frustrate Black communities all across the North, but a lot of white Northerners are thinking, well, wait a minute, I didn't think I had anything to do with slavery, but now, as a resident of Clinton, Massachusetts, I'm supposed to, by law, I'm supposed to return someone, who comes to my house for aid and a drink of water and a place to sleep. I have a right as a resident of Massachusetts to keep slavery outside my borders as a state. So we get this interesting, almost ironic change in Northern opinion. I'm talking about white opinion, of course, because Black people had already come along to the conclusion about the illegitimacy of slavery. But I'm talking about white, so-called moderates. And they're saying, look, what does it mean to be a free state if I can't have the right to keep slavery out of my state? So a Northern states' rights ideology, a Northern states' rights philosophy emerges in this period as more and more, sort of fence-sitting moderate white Northerners come to the conclusion that they don't want to be part of this compromise with Southern slavery. And in large part, that shift in Northern public opinion over time is going to help bring on the Civil War and unite many Northerners to fight for the Union.
So that actually leads to, that's a perfect segue into my next question. Being an ex-New Yorker myself too, there's always a conflict between the city and the state. Upstate and the city are always in real political, there are different needs. So did a political movement start in upstate that also sort of, like when you think of Albany and the rest, that started to pressure the city to kind of get its act in gear as it got closer to the Civil War? Yeah,
that's a really good question and an important point, because again, it's one of these circumstances in which our modern sensibility, sort of our modern understanding of how politics works in the United States is completely turned on its head in the years before the Civil War. So today, quite rightly, if you look at the map of the voters in 2020, you see that overwhelmingly urban voters tended to vote for Joe Biden, right? Whether that was Charlotte, North Carolina, or Austin, Texas, or Los Angeles, or Philadelphia. So, where you are in the country, cities tend to vote Democratic. they tend to be more progressive politically. Whereas the rural areas we have become accustomed to seeing as basically fundamentally conservative and sort of tradition bound, and they tend to vote for Republicans, and certainly did so for Trump in the last election. So in this period of American history we're talking about now, though, in the early 19th
Yeah.
century, it was completely different.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, so you had New York City, Manhattan was the one that were the arch conservatives, particularly when it came to race. And it's not to say that, you know, upstate New Yorkers weren't, of course, you know, given to racism, just like most people, white people in the United States were. But it is important to realize that some of the most powerful anti-slavery voices in New York, guys like William Henry Seward, they came, you know, from the state, not the city. So, because of the evangelical Great Awakenings, places like upstate New York had become, you know, hotbeds of abolitionism to some extent. You know, you don't want to overstate that, because there's still conservative voices there too on matters of race, maybe even the predominant voice. But the contrast is clear, you know, that the split between urban and rural that we've come accustomed to in modern politics was very different in this period of American history.
Yeah, I was thinking, you know, because I would assume in upstate pre-Civil War, they're not seeing the quote unquote benefits of slavery, right? So the city is seeing they're making some serious money. So they want to keep that money line going. Whereas the folks in the state might come at it from a more sort of, for lack of a better word, a moral standpoint. They see it as a philosophical standpoint.
Yeah,
And
I think that's a good sketch of what happens. I mean, it's interesting that, you know, it's more apparent in places like New York City, this racial conservatism, this willingness to sacrifice Black bodies on the altar of the American Union. But, you know, the nation itself is growing more prosperous, more politically powerful, more important as a foreign power. And you just can't disentangle that from American slavery. You know, that American story is every bit made up of the components that give rise to that prosperity, including, you know, the cotton trade and Southern slavery. And that's something that a lot of historians have talked about recently. Ed Baptist, Caitlin Rosenthal, Walter Johnson, Sven Beckert, you know, a lot of folks, Seth Rockman, they've you know, sort of understood that the rise of American power in the first half of the 19th century was in no small part based on, you know, the wealth produced by the cotton trade that was grown, you know, by 4 million, almost 4 million enslaved Black people.
And one of my last questions, because I think it's a fascinating subject. It must have been like a gold mine to find Ruggles magazine, right?
Yeah, it's
so because you've got like firsthand, you know, primary source data in its own way. No,
that
you
helped
know?
a lot. Yeah, it really did. In part because, you know, Ruggles provides proper names. You know,
Yes.
you can then take to the census, you can take to city directories, you can search for proper names in other newspapers of the time, like the New York Sun or the Herald or the Times. So that really helped a lot. But, you know, he also recorded almost word for word, verbatim, the conversations he had with people.
Which is
So that, I hope at least, that allowed me to sort of bring to life some of these stories that make up, you know, the bulk of the book I wrote. But, you know, again, I'm just telling Ruggles' stories because he's the one who lived it. He's the hero. You know, he's the one who gave his life to fight against racial injustice. And I'm just, you know, sort of a conduit to make it, I hope, his story much better known.
It's a wonderful kind of way. So I say last question, and then there's two more questions. Number one, which archives did you use to get this data? And number two, you say he died early. Did he have a family? Was he threatened? You know, how did he die?
He was constantly threatened. He was arrested by Boudinot at least once and put in jail and taken before Riker at least once. So, you know, Boudinot and Nash and Riker and Pettis, they all absolutely know who Ruggles is. And you know, they fight him in the courts and outside the courts in the streets of New York and Brooklyn. But he actually, it's not clear what malady he suffered from, but he was losing his sight at a relatively early age. And, you know, in part, I'm sure that these daily struggles, these battles against the Kidnapping Club were taking their physical toll. And ultimately, what he did in about 1842 is he moved to Northampton, Massachusetts. Yeah, and he became, you know, sort of a Massachusetts activist for the last few years of his life. But he died at the end of the 1840s when, if I remember correctly, he's only like, you know, 30, 35 years old. So, yeah, he absolutely, you know, gave his life. What was the first part of your question? I'm sorry.
Archives. Where did you find your information?
Yeah, good question. Well, one of the things that's been made a lot easier from the historian's perspective in the last 20 years is the digitizing of so many newspapers. So, you know, one of the things that's great about being at the University of Michigan is that it gives me access to a lot of databases, literally tens of thousands of newspapers that you can read or you can search. So newspapers were absolutely key to this. I also went to the Historical Society in New York. I went to the New York Public Library, which also has some great stuff in the 19th century. I went to the New York City Museum, which was really cool. So yeah, I got to not only read stuff from my computer, but also get into the actual archives. This was all obviously before COVID hit, and many of these archives had closed. And by the way, not far from you all is one of the great resources for American historians, particularly those who study the 19th century and the late 18th century, and that is the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester,
Right.
which is just this amazing institution. And I have been there many, many, many times and on different projects that I've worked on. And what a great resource for so between archives and research that one can do from a laptop computer, that really comprised the bulk of the archival research.
I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much.
Oh, can I ask you a quick question? What was the name of the paper that David Ruggles wrote?
It's called The Mirror of Liberty.
Okay, thank you.
Try to Google it. You know, Ruggles does have a Wikipedia page. You can check that out. But they have been digitized by some private companies, but I don't know if they're available for free to the public. But that would be a cool thing if they were, because people could, you know, sort of read these things for themselves. And they're just, you know, they're newspaper size, really. And for a while there, he was publishing them every month. And they're just these, you know, column after column after column of details of his interactions with the,
Incredible.
you know, the nefarious actors of the Kidnapping Club.
How did he afford it?
Well, that's a good question. He ran a grocery store for a while. He had a bookshop. He was in part supported by wealthy benefactors in the New York Vigilance Committee. But, you know, this is not something that he's going to become wealthy off of. On the contrary, he's living, you know, pretty much week to week. But he had his, apparently he had his own, you know, sort of simple printing press that he could use, you know, to print these newspapers. So, yeah, pretty cool.
So no pressure, but what's next?
So I'm working on a project about New York City during the Civil War and immediately after, really about sort of the draft riots, the reaction in New York City against the Emancipation Proclamation, you know, white violence against Black New Yorkers, kind of continuing the theme, but, you know, during the Civil War itself.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Mira, thank you for co-hosting tonight. And I look forward to seeing this all on your YouTube site. And so For those of you who are watching this, make sure that you let people know that the Lunenburg Library and the Clinton Bigelow Library co-hosted this event, and thank Professor Wells for participating in this. And that if you missed anything, we'll be posting this on our YouTube site.
Thank you so much for inviting
Thank
me.
you.
Thank
That
you
was
so much.
Thank you.
really awesome. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.